Something big is happening in the world of computing, and if you've been paying even a little attention, you can feel the shift. It's subtle at first, almost invisible. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. For years, Linux has been the quiet powerhouse, the backbone of servers, the engine behind Android, the system that developers trusted, but everyday users often ignored. Meanwhile, Windows remained the default choice for millions of people around the world, especially on personal computers. It was familiar, widely supported, and deeply embedded into how people worked, studied, and played. But now, something has changed, and it's not just another update or a minor improvement. This is a turning point, the kind that quietly rewrites the future before most people even realize what's happening. What's unfolding right now isn't just about Linux getting better, it's about Linux crossing a line that many thought it would never cross. It's moving beyond being an alternative and stepping into a space where it can genuinely replace what people have relied on Windows for. And that's where things get interesting, because this shift isn't just good news for Linux users, it's potentially very bad news for Windows, and not in a dramatic overnight collapse kind of way, but in a slow, undeniable erosion of dominance that becomes impossible to ignore over time. To understand why this matters, you have to look at how the computing world has evolved. There was a time when operating systems were everything. Choosing between Windows, Mac OS, or Linux defined your entire experience. Your software, your workflow, your compatibility, everything depended on that choice. But today, more and more of what we do happens in the browser or in cross-platform apps. Cloud services have blurred the lines. Developers are building tools that work everywhere, not just on one system. And in this new environment, Linux has a unique advantage that Windows is struggling to match. Linux is not tied down in the same way. It doesn't carry the same legacy baggage. It's modular, flexible, and increasingly user-friendly. Over the past few years, Linux distributions have made massive strides in usability. Installing Linux today is nothing like it was a decade ago. You don't need to be a technical expert anymore. The interfaces are polished, the hardware support is better, and the overall experience has become surprisingly smooth. For many users, especially those who are even slightly tech-curious, Linux is no longer intimidating. It's approachable, and that changes everything. But the real shift goes deeper than just usability. It's about control. More and more users are becoming aware of how much control they've given up in modern computing. Automatic updates, forced restarts, background data collection, and increasing system requirements have made people feel like they don't fully own their own machines anymore. Windows, in particular, has faced criticism for this. Each new version seems to demand more from the user while giving less control in return. And that's where Linux quietly stands apart. Linux offers something that's becoming rare: freedom. You can shape the system the way you want. You decide what gets installed, what runs in the background, how updates are handled, and how your data is managed. There's no hidden agenda, no forced integration with services you didn't ask for. For a growing number of people, that level of control isn't just a nice feature, it's a necessity. And once someone experiences that freedom, it's hard to go back. At the same time, developers are increasingly favoring Linux environments. Tools, frameworks, and workflows are often designed with Linux in mind first. Even on Windows, many developers rely on compatibility layers or subsystems just to replicate a Linux-like experience. That alone says a lot. When the people building the future of software prefer Linux, it creates a ripple effect. It means better tools, better support, and more innovation happening in that ecosystem. Gaming was once considered the biggest barrier for Linux adoption, but even that is changing rapidly. Advances in compatibility layers and platform support have made it possible to run a huge portion of popular games on Linux with little to no issues. Performance has improved, setup has become easier, and the gap that once seemed impossible to close is shrinking fast. It's not perfect yet, but it's no longer a deal breaker for many users. And once gaming is no longer a major obstacle, one of Windows' strongest advantages begins to weaken. Hardware support has also improved significantly. Major manufacturers are paying more attention to Linux compatibility. Drivers are more stable, installation is smoother, and out-of-the-box functionality is better than ever. In many cases, Linux now works seamlessly on hardware that used to be considered Windows-only territory. That shift didn't happen overnight, but it's reached a point where it's hard to ignore. Another factor that's quietly pushing this change forward is cost. Linux is free, not just in terms of price, but in terms of long-term value. There are no licensing fees, no upgrade costs, and no artificial limitations. For individuals, students, and organizations trying to reduce expenses, this matters a lot. When you combine zero cost with increasing usability and performance, Linux becomes an incredibly attractive option. Meanwhile, Windows is moving in a different direction. It's becoming more integrated with services, more dependent on accounts, and more restrictive in certain ways. Some users are fine with that, but others are starting to question it. They're asking whether they really need all of that complexity, or whether there's a simpler, more transparent alternative. And for many, Linux is starting to look like that alternative. The shift isn't happening in a loud, dramatic way. There's no single moment where everything changes. Instead, it's happening quietly, step by step. A developer switches to Linux for work. A student installs it on an old laptop and realizes it runs better than Windows ever did. A gamer tries it out and finds that most of their library works just fine. A company adopts it to cut costs and improve control. Each of these decisions might seem small on its own, but together they create momentum. And momentum is powerful. Once it builds, it becomes self-sustaining. More users lead to more support. More support leads to better software. Better software attracts even more users. It's a cycle that feeds itself, and Linux is right in the middle of it. What makes this particularly significant is that Windows doesn't have an easy way to respond. It can improve, it can adapt, but it can't fundamentally change its nature without disrupting its own ecosystem. It's tied to decades of legacy systems, business models, and user expectations. That gives it strength, but it also limits its flexibility. Linux, on the other hand, can evolve more freely. It doesn't have the same constraints, and that gives it an edge in a rapidly changing environment. This doesn't mean Windows is going to disappear. It's still incredibly dominant, and it will remain relevant for a long time. But dominance doesn't last forever, especially in technology. What we're seeing now is the early stage of a shift, one that could reshape how people think about operating systems altogether. For a long time, Linux was seen as the underdog, the system you used if you were a developer or an enthusiast. That perception is changing. It's becoming a viable choice for everyday users, and in some cases, a better one. That's the line it has crossed, the point where it stops being the alternative and starts being the option. And once that happens, everything changes. Because now the question isn't why would you use Linux? It's why wouldn't you? That's the moment Windows has to worry about. Not because it loses users overnight, but because it loses its unquestioned position. Because once people start considering alternatives seriously, the landscape shifts. Competition increases, expectations change, and the balance of power begins to move. We're not at the end of that journey yet. In many ways, we're just at the beginning. But the direction is clear. Linux is no longer standing on the sidelines. It's stepping into the spotlight, and it's doing so with a level of readiness that it never had before. For users, this is an opportunity. More choice, more control, and more innovation. For Windows, it's a challenge, one that will require careful navigation in the years ahead. And for the tech world as a whole, it's a reminder that nothing stays the same forever. Because sometimes the biggest changes don't arrive with a bang. They happen quietly, steadily, until one day you look around and realize everything is different. And that's exactly what's happening right now with Linux.